Welcome to the webinar. We'll get started shortly. Before we begin, here's how to earn CPE credit. Unlike traditional CPE webinars, there are no polling questions or attendance checks during the presentation. Instead, you will demonstrate your knowledge by taking a brief multiple-choice quiz in the Earmark app. Search for the free Earmark app from the App Store or Google Play Store, or scan the QR code on the screen. Open the app and create an account. Be sure to use a valid email address because we'll email you your CPE certificates. From the home screen, scroll down to find the course. You can also tap the magnifying glass icon to search for the course. Tap on the course artwork, then the Enroll button. On the Course tab, you'll find the recording and quiz questions. If you don't see the quiz yet, don't worry. We'll email you when the quiz is available. Complete the quiz to earn your CPE certificate. If you have questions or need help, email us anytime at support@earmarkcpe.com. Now, on to the webinar.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Adding SOC Services to Your Firm. My name is Joel from the Earmark team, and if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to use the comment section. And with that, I will turn it over to our host for today's webinar, Jeff Cook.
Thank you, Joel, and welcome everybody. Happy to be here today, teaching you a little bit about how to start a SOC practice at your firm. Something that I've been doing a long time, and I've done this a couple times, of establishing practices at firms. So happy to share my knowledge with you, and hopefully you can learn something new today, or maybe even expand on some of the practices that you do at your firm currently, and to establish either a new SOC practice or help refine your current practice a little bit. Before I get started, I'll introduce myself in a second, but as Joel mentioned, please, if you have questions or comments or anything like that, drop them in the chat. I love interacting during the presentations. I don't mind being interrupted. I also don't mind waiting until the end. Whatever you guys want to do is fine, but please feel free. I love to answer questions and make sure that I'm addressing the things that you have on your mind as you're going through and learning something here today. So please, again, drop them in the comments, or at the end, we'll have some open session too. All right, so a quick introduction to myself so you know who's talking here today. I'm Jeff Cook. I'm a CPA. I've been a CPA for quite a while now. And over half my career, I've been doing SOC work. So I started as a traditional financial auditor, doing many years of busy season financial audits. And then as we kind of shifted more into this realm of IT controls and SOCs and all that came up, I started taking an interest in control testing for financial statement purposes. That evolved into more SOC work, etc. And from there, I got involved with the AICPA a little bit on some of their task forces and committees and guidance writing and FAQs and teaching like this, and then expanded my teaching to do more of that on my own like we're doing today, and happy to do that. It's one of my favorite things to do, is to teach. I love it, and I'm glad to be able to teach everything that I know to everybody who attends my sessions. So happy to teach you today. So that's just kind of what I got going on. I'm also a SOC peer review specialist, so that's what helps in some of these things that we're going to talk about today with establishing the practice, right? So ultimately, when you have a SOC practice, you're going to want to pass peer review. That's going to be part of having the practice, and hopefully some of the things I can talk about today will help you with that. So let's talk about those learning objectives quickly. We're going to just kind of go over a quick overview of SOC services for those of us that are learning about what that is. We're going to talk about value propositions and what's needed in a practice. How do we scope and price engagements? That's going to be a really important one, because planning and engagement is so crucial, similar to a financial statement audit, right? Where you have to plan that audit accordingly for it to be successful. It's the same thing on a SOC audit. What the typical engagement process looks like as we go through it, practice implementation checklist, other practice areas, and then I'm going to give some resources at the end. So with that, let's talk first about the SOC suite of services. So the AICPA has this on their website. Again, I'll have that resource at the end, but they call it the SOC suite of services. What does that consist of? The first one is SOC 1. SOC 1 was kind of the original SOC, as we call it. So going back all the way to SAS 70s, before that, And then it was SSA 16. Some of you might be familiar with. SSA 18 was even more recent. We're actually up to SSA 21 now that affects these engagements. But SOC 1 is a report of internal controls for financial reporting. So ICFR, as we go through this presentation today, you might hear me say that a couple times. Again, that was internal controls over financial reporting. So what does that mean? That's basically what are the controls that the company has in place that impact the financial reporting of their customers, right? So we're going to get into all this in a little bit more detail, but that's basically what SOC 1 is going to be about. SOC 2 then came along because SOC 1, again, more financial focused. Well, we had companies that weren't financial focused, that were, let's say, software applications or cloud applications, software as a service, etc. They needed something to talk about security, availability of these services. We're going to, again, get into all the more details of this in a little bit. That's where SOC 2 came in. So SOC 2 doesn't necessarily have a financial impact. It's more security based with some other, they call them categories, which are really what does the system do for customers? And we're going to get into that too. SOC 3 is, think of it as a public-facing version of a SOC 2. And what do I mean by public-facing? It means that we redact some of the sensitive information from the SOC 2 because, again, SOC 2 is a security-based report, so it's going to talk about some controls that the company has in place for security. That's pretty sensitive. So we redact some of that, and we put that SOC 3 report, usually it's companies will put it on their website, they'll use it for marketing purposes, etc. So basically think of a SOC 2 as something that you would have to have a non-disclosure with your customer for, whereas a SOC 3, you can just throw it out there on the website publicly. We then have in the newer SOC offerings that came from the AICPA, SOC for cybersecurity, and also SOC for supply chain. So SOC for cybersecurity is similar to a SOC 2 in that it does focus on security, but think of it more of a cybersecurity risk management program for an entity as a whole, or it could be specific divisions at larger entities, but let's just stick with for an entity as a whole for now. So it basically talks about what is the cyber program for this entity. It's a more narrative report where it's meant for boards of directors and things like that, for them to understand the cybersecurity program and how it's operating, as opposed to a SOC 2, which is more system oriented. How is this system secure? Things like that. And then SOC for supply chain is kind of inherent in the name. It basically talks about supply chain, both upstream and downstream. Again, very closely related to SOC 2 in that it talks about security and things like that, but it's more supply chain focused. So definitely the AICPA was focusing on manufacturing, distribution, things like that when they did this. It doesn't mean you can't do a SOC for supply chain with let's say a SaaS provider, but typically you'll see it more in the manufacturing areas. Okay. So this slide is interesting. It's based on a 2020 survey by the AICPA, but in my opinion, I don't think these numbers have decreased at all. Maybe they're even higher now, very likely. But some key takeaways in this survey is that SOC 1 is remaining strong as ever because SOC 1 reports impact financial statements, again, like I mentioned before. And the auditors of these customers of our service organizations are going to want to see that information for their financial statement audits. So that's why SOC 1 is strong. The increasing awareness, though, of cybersecurity and the importance of IT and cybersecurity led to significant increases in the demand for SOC 2 engagements. And we've seen this go up. Like a lot of clients, for example, they'll come and they'll say, oh, I've got to do these security questionnaires, or I've got a contract requirement. And that's where SOC 2 comes into play, because SOC 2 can replace those security questionnaires a lot of times. I'm not guaranteeing it could be every time, but a lot of times it will replace those. It will also help satisfy those contractual obligations, things like that. So that's why we've seen a lot of increase in SOC 2. And again, I would argue these numbers are probably even higher today than they were 4 years ago. We're starting to see some traction with the SOC Cyber that I mentioned. I have done that report a couple times. because I think that boards of directors are starting to pay more attention, especially with some of the recent SEC rules that have come out. So I think that boards and things like that are going to be looking more to a report like a SOC Cyber, which again is more narrative to tell the more holistic story of what's going on in the cybersecurity program. So we might see more traction in that as well. So these are all reasons why, if you are thinking about starting a SOC practice or you've heard about it, this is why a lot of firms have adopted these practices and built them up over the last couple of years. So let's talk more about the value proposition. Because of all this happening, you want the firm to stay current. Firm partners and owners, they're going to want to build the legacy of successful and profitable firm that adjusts to times as they continue to change, and they're going to continue to change. We're seeing it a lot now, even with AI, right? So it's time to start thinking outside of traditional audit, accounting, and tax. Absolutely it is. The competitors that you have against your CPA firm may already have this, right? So you need to think about, can you gain new clients with a SOC practice, retain the current ones you have, because maybe they need or they're going to need a SOC report in the future. So you want to retain those clients without them going to another firm to get what they need. You can create partner or alliance relationships if you want to do that. But if you want to keep the work in-house, consider developing the practice. And that's why we're here today. How do you identify these new clients? Keep in mind, they could be new or existing clients through cross-selling, right? If you're already doing internal control over financial reporting work, maybe as part of financial statement audits, clients are going to consider you as a trusted advisor in evaluating those controls. This expertise then can extend to these new services, for example, evaluating the security controls of the system, right? So newer existing clients that are going to benefit from SOC services, clients that tie into customer financial statements or internal control over financial reporting. Again, that's SOC 1. Let me give you some examples. I like examples. I think it's the best way to communicate some of these things sometimes. Payroll processors, medical claims processors, loan servicing, data centers who might be storing financial information. Those are the types of organizations that are going to be more probably going to need a SOC 1. So that's why we think, okay, if I've got clients like that, okay, I need to think about SOC 1 and do they need that? Clients that are receiving requests. Again, I talked about security questionnaires. That's the biggest thing I see when I get phone calls about, hey, I need SOC. Why? I get tons of security questionnaires, okay? Number 2, contractual obligations. Client is saying, my customers are saying, in order to do business with them, I need to have a SOC 2. It's very common in contracts these days because it's so widely recognized. That's going to be a big reason that you see SOC 2. Data security, obviously a hot topic, has been for a few years now. So again, financial impact clients, SOC 1, security, contractual obligations for data security, etc., SOC 2, right? Clients whose controls are routinely audited by customer organizations. That happens sometimes where a client will say, I've always got my customer who's sending out auditors to look at certain controls. Well, that could apply to SOC 1 or 2. And then clients that routinely obtain or process or transmit customer data, that's going to go to SOC 2. If it's just a regular processing of data, if it is financial processing, then we need to talk about SOC 1 as well. But examples there would include cloud-based applications, hosting, IT, outsourcing, or managed service providers. A lot of organizations can fall under that, right? So you'd want to think about, if we're a processor, how are we processing? Is it the data secure as it processes through the system? That's where SOC's going to come into play for that. Okay. So once we have that, we need to talk about revenue, cost, budget, right? So the firm is going to have to determine whether the new SOC practice is going to generate an amount of revenue that's going to justify adding a new service. Considering revenue, you want to think about your billing strategy, right? So how are you going to bill? Not only how much revenue you're going to generate, how are you going to bill it? Typical pricing that I see is value pricing by the service. SOC services can be offered in either fixed fee or time and material pricing options. In most cases, though, SOC services are going to be quoted to the client on a fixed fee basis, right? So price, I usually see blended rates. unless the client requests otherwise, which some do. But typically it's going to be fixed fee with blended rates. That's how we're going to do it. Tier offerings are very common. So for example, SOC 2 examinations can be readiness. They can be a type 1, they can be a type 2. It could have additional subject matter, which is known as a SOC 2 plus. By the way, we are going to get into type 1 and type 2 in a little bit when we talk about scoping. But the point that I'm trying to make right now is that you want to price the different level of service accordingly. A SOC 2 readiness is going to be a lot different than a SOC 2 type 2 full-blown audit, right? So you want to have almost like a pricing matrix in place when you're thinking about this. How you want to bill it? Do you want to bill it upon kickoff? Do you want to bill all of it upon kickoff? Do you want to bill all of it after the end of the engagement? Do you want to do a 50-50? Do you want to do a tiered billing over a certain period of time? That's going to be up to you and the firm to determine how you normally recognize revenue, what the client's used to, etc. Okay, so as far as costs go, a number of factors may add cost to the new opportunity, some of which are going to be directly billed, some of which might not. Actually, quite a few might not. A few of these considerations to include: staffing, going to be your biggest cost center as usual, labor, right? So there may be additional costs though related to training the current staff, hiring new personnel with the appropriate skill set or competencies, or engaging specialists even. So maybe it's not a full-time employee, maybe it's bringing a 1099 contractor in, right, as needed. I mentioned the educational costs. That's going to be not only on the front end of educating your full-time employees, but also continuing education, right? CPEs, like we're doing today. Marketing, you're going to have to develop marketing materials, website content, to talk about your firm's new SOC services, at least initially, right? So you're going to have to bring that into perspective when you think about the cost of establishing this practice. Quality control, the skills and expertise of the firm's new SOC team enable the performance of effective quality control reviews over SOC services? So if no one aside from the engagement partner has technical expertise and SOC experience required to perform a QC review, a partner relationship may be needed to perform QC reviews. It's called an engagement quality control review, EQCR, right? You either have to train up your QC department to do that, or you can outsource that. There's nothing that says you can't have an outsourced party do an engagement quality control review for you. So you want to make sure you're factoring that in when you're thinking about, are we going to establish this practice or not? And then finally, like I mentioned, peer review. SOC examinations, be very clear here, are must select engagements in a peer review. So therefore, they're always subject to peer review. The firm's peer review costs may increase as a result of that, right? Peer review might take longer, etc. The firm is also going to have to consider, your firm is going to also have to consider if your peer reviewer, your current one, has the skills, competencies, and expertise to perform the peer review of your firm now with this SOC practice. If not, you might have to look for a different peer reviewer, or a lot of times what will happen is that peer review firm will bring in a SOC specialist. That's what I am in peer review. I'm a SOC specialist, right? So if a peer review firm doesn't have that, they'll call me and they'll say, hey, we need you to help us with this peer review. That brings though additional cost, right? So you want to think about that from that point of view when you're establishing your kind of cost benefit analysis of doing this practice. And then I do want to mention here the use of tools at the end. A number of technology companies offer software solutions or tools to improve efficiency that clients can prepare for or undergo specifically SOC 2 examinations. We've heard a lot about these tools. These tool providers advertise efficiencies that their software provides to the auditor. If the client uses these tools, it's important to remember, though, that you, as the auditor, are still responsible for performing a SOC 2 audit or examination in accordance with your professional standards. So as the auditor, you're going to have to evaluate any tool being used and determine if the tool results in a significant decrease in effort, assuming the cost is going to be lower. So basically, is the client using a tool? How's that going to impact my quote? Right? You have to think about that. There's a whole, I put the link there. If you need more information on how clients' use of these tools might affect you as an auditor, have to meet the professional standards and requirements, including risks. There's a good FAQ. I was actually involved in writing that FAQ. It's on the screen right there. Take a look at that if that's something that's going to directly impact your practice. Okay. So what's needed from a staffing perspective? Well, you need people with a particular set of skills and competencies. They've got a particular set of skills, right? So although some of these skills and competencies, such as analytical skills, expertise in evaluating processes and control effectiveness, ability to apply judgment, professional skepticism, they're similar to what's needed in a financial statement audit, right? Which is why I was able to transition from a financial auditor to an IT auditor. But there are other skills and competencies that are different. So meaning you might have to look more about security of a cloud environment, right? So you'd have to develop that. SOC 1 is even different from that. You'd have to think about how does this system process this information accurately, right? So you have to consider, do your firm's personnel have these skills, or do you need to either acquire them or train them, or what is it, right? So really, what are the skills here that I've got on the screen for the different types of SOCs? Well, for any SOC, right, you have to understand professional standards, legal, regulatory requirements. SOC is under SSA 21, as I mentioned, and you've got a lot of standards that need to be followed under that. So there's a lot of familiarity with financial audit standards, but there are differences. So you have to have people who are aware of what those differences are. They have to apply, again, judgment, like I mentioned, understanding your firm's quality control policies and procedures, which, by the way, you are going to have to update those if you have SOC engagements, because you're going to have to address those because peer review is going to look at them. Technical expertise, as I mentioned, so expertise with IT general controls, such as access, logical access, change management, backups, incident response, things like that. They have to know, how do we test these things for our clients, right? Knowledge of the relevant industry. So what does it mean when you have a software as a service, SaaS provider? Okay, what does it mean when they sit on an infrastructure provider, et cetera? They have to know that. Understanding of preventive, detective, corrective control activities as part of a multi-layer approach to an engagement risk, and ability to design tests and controls based on the control activities of the client. So they have to understand what the client does. Here's how data moves through the system, et cetera, and how the controls affect that, and then how do we test that? So that's common to all of them. Quick drink break here. Okay, SOC 1. So again, focusing on internal controls over financial reporting for their customers. You might be able to leverage existing financial audit expertise to provide this, but appropriate competencies are going to include SOC 1 practical experience through training and participation in how these controls relate to financial statements, understand the client service, industry-specific risks. That's a big one, right? You have to, in similar to a financial audit, you have to look at the audit risk. What's the risk of us not, or the client not meeting our objectives, or not meeting the processing correctly, et cetera? So you have to understand the industry risks related to that client. Specialized areas of accounting or auditing relevant to the services, experience with evaluating the suitability of design and operational effectiveness over financial reporting using a framework such as COSO, right? So that's going to be something that's very specific to SOC 1. In SOC 2 and SOC 3, again, SOC 3 being a redacted or public version of SOC 2, these focus on controls at the service organization relevant to 5 categories I mentioned before: security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, privacy. So SOC 2 doesn't necessarily do all 5. You can do any combination of the 5. Almost every SOC 2 does security. As a matter of fact, I can't recall one that hasn't. But you add the other 4 in as needed based on what commitments the client makes to customers. If you need more training on SOC 2, there's a lot of other trainings out there we can talk about. So I don't need to get into all the details there. Again, more of how you're establishing a practice here today. So SOC 2, what are some appropriate competencies and capabilities for team members with SOC 2 and 3? Understanding of the systems, the services that's being provided, operational aspects of the system, security of the system. And again, how do you do that? You gain experience through similar clients or complexity through similar clients, appropriate training, participation, etc. Also knowing the industry that that client operates in and their risks, again, may be different from financial risks right here. Most likely they are. What's the risks here? Understanding of business processes, risk and controls, IT systems and technologies such as networks, boundary protection, security protocols, cloud-based systems, key applications, operating systems, databases, all that kind of stuff is going to be more SOC 2 relevant. Uncommon technologies or industry-specific technologies that are used by the client, you're going to want to make sure when you understand with the client what this system is, okay, do I have somebody that understands this or not? Or do I need to bring in a specialist or hire somebody? So understanding security techniques, principles, concepts, system development, life cycle, incident management and response, information risk management. Those are all the things you have to think about when you're doing testing as well in SOC 2. And then determining how you determine categories and criteria that are in scope that I mentioned before. Okay. So if you do have to go and get people that are outside of the firm, what do we do about recruiting? Well, these are very labor intensive engagements, right? So you're going to need people to do them. They're going to take a lot of hours to do them. So determining the scope of the examination, nature of client, its industry. SOC examinations may be from 100 to 500 hours or more, depending on the size of the client, complexity of the system, etc. They could take 6 to 10 weeks of effort. We'll talk about scoping in a little bit. In addition to the determination of skill sets, like we discussed, the firm's going to have to consider if sufficient personnel and hours are available to perform these engagements. So again, do you have the appropriate skill set people in-house? I keep saying that. It's so important because you can't just bring a financial auditor into this world and say, do a SOC 2. They have to have the appropriate skill sets. Are personnel likely to meet the demand? So do you have enough hours for this person? Again, you can't just take a financial audit person and say, okay, you're going to do this, but I still need you to work a full busy season because it takes a lot of time to do it, right? Hiring strategy, are you going to have to develop one to recruit new personnel for these skills and competencies? And this is where you might have to look in areas where you haven't looked before, right? So you might have to look at computer science majors or something like that instead of traditional accounting majors that maybe your firm has looked at in the past. So if you have to go to that level, how do you recruit them? Master of Accountancy with IT systems, that's a great one. IT or cyber assurance or data analytics degree programs, IT internal auditors. If you're going to look for people who have work experience already, IT internal audit is great. Financial auditors, but again, you might have to supplement their skill set with IT competencies here. But then also looking at trade associations. There's other associations besides the AICPA that are very involved in IT audits, such as ISACA, ISSA, or other state CPA societies might have specific IT audit things in their repertoire. So firms may also, though, decide to engage a specialist in SOC services. When using a specialist, the engagement partner is going to be responsible for determining the specialist has the necessary competence, capabilities, and objectivity. Remember that specialist also has to be independent, as well as evaluating the adequacy of their work that was performed. So use of a 1099 specialist is absolutely allowed, and a lot of firms do it, but you want to make sure that that is not only the right person to do the job, but that they're being supervised ultimately by the engagement partner. And then finally, training and certifications. If training staff is the route that you think is going to be the best way to go, make sure you have the right CPE for them that focuses on the skill sets they need. The AICPA SOC school, I've taught that before. That's a great way to get people up to date on what goes on in SOC. It's a 2-day intensive. I've taught it, again, very good way to do it. If staff are going to go down your certification path, recommended certifications for personnel who are going to do this are going to be obviously CPA, but also the CITP, which the AICPA offers. You have the CISA, which is from ISACA, CIA, CISSP. But then if you have other things besides SOC that the client's going to be doing, such as PCI or ISO, you're going to want to have people maybe get trained up on being a PCI QSA or an ISO lead auditor, et cetera. So that's, you got to think long-term, right? If the client's saying SOC is our first step, but we're going to want to do ISO eventually, okay, you got to make sure your person that's going to be in charge also has ISO experience. Okay, I mentioned independence, similar to a financial statement audit. SOC, again, management has responsibility, management of the client has responsibility for the SOC report, but ultimately the auditor has to be independent of management in order to audit it, similar to financial statement, right? So the vendor, independence is going to have to, you're going to have to think about the scope of the services that's being performed, including non-ad test. Okay, so that's important, right? So if you're doing, you can't advise the client on SOC as well as do their audit, similar to financial statement. You can't do consulting and auditing at the same time. You can help them with certain things, right? So when we do, let's say, a gap analysis, we call it, or readiness assessment, that's basically telling the client, here's where you are today versus here's where you would need to be for a successful SOC 2. Here's where your gaps are. Nothing wrong with doing that. If you're doing other forms of services such as like pen testing or something like that, that's again a means of saying, here's where you're vulnerable, go fix that. That's okay. When you start saying, here's how you fix it, here's how we can help you fix it, that's when you'll run into some independence issues. So you don't want to go down that road. Quality control, I'm going to start moving a little bit faster here. I want to make sure we get through the presentation. Hold on, I got a quick question. Security category of the trust services criteria is mandatory. Actually, that's not true, Raymond. You can, in theory, there is nothing in the guidance that prevents you from doing, let's say, for example, an availability only SOC 2 report. It doesn't make a lot of sense to do it because you would need the common criteria, which is ultimately the security criteria. But you could ultimately say in the opinion, you're only opining on the availability category, and so therefore you have the common criteria plus the availability criteria. We had a long discussion on this in one of the SOC 2 working groups I'm in. And ultimately, yeah, you could do it in theory. I've never seen anybody do it. I'm not sure why you would do it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. In theory, you could though. So just FYI out there, it was a weird thing to talk about, but yeah. Okay, so quality control, right? Again, we talked about you need to have people who are up to date with the quality control standards. You need to have somebody who's ultimately responsible for the quality control, et cetera, who's competent in that. So EQCR, as I mentioned before, it's a non-objective, non-engagement partner evaluation before the report's released. SOC 2, again, they're must-select engagements, so they're going to be in peer review. So you want to make sure you're having some sort of quality control review done, making sure that's part of it. And then, as I mentioned, in peer review, this is required. If you're not familiar with peer review, it's required by state boards of accountancy wherever your firm is registered. The AICPA has a peer review program called PRIMA. You can use that. You can use the state board for peer review as well. Again, these are must-select engagements. So you're going to have a SOC 1, you're going to have a SOC 2 selected if you're doing both. If you're only doing one or the other, that's fine. They're going to select that. But just remember that these are must-select. So you have to have a program in place, not only in your firm's policies and procedures, but you're going to have engagement documentation, et cetera. FYI, the peer review checklists are publicly available from the AICPA. That's a great way to do kind of your own firm's gap analysis on where you are for your own peer review purposes, right? Go down those AICPA checklists and say, do we do this? Do we do this? And is it documented? That's the thing, right? It's the same as an audit. When a peer reviewer comes in, it's got to be documented. I got to be able to see it. You can't just say, oh, we do that, but we don't have anything documented on it. Okay, well, I don't know you did that. So you got to be able to see it, right? So that's important. Okay. All right, so does a client need SOC and which one? We kind of talked a little about this, but I want to kind of stress the point because I want to get to the scoping. So questions that you're going to ask right here. These are typical questions that I've seen over the years when people are needing SOC. Have they been asked for a SOC report, or again, older terminology, SAS 70, SSA 16, SSA 18. I still see that terminology being used today. So if you hear any of those buzzwords, it's going to mean SOC, right? Again, are they getting security questionnaires? That's a reason to get SOC. Any contracts with customers or business partners mention obtaining a SOC report. Competitors providing SOC reports to customers or business partners. That's going to be the types of questions you want to ask your clients. Are they doing any of this? Are they getting any of this? If yes, okay, we need to talk about doing SOC work. Okay, so that applies to both SOC 1 and 2. When we're talking about scoping, does the customer or your clients, let's say that, does your client's system impact customer financial statements? Answer is yes. We have to figure out what objectives do you have for customers of the system. You, meaning the client, have for customers of the system. You're going to have, from there, you're going to have objectives related to IT general controls or ITGC. So that's going to be security, change management, access, those things I was mentioning before. But you're also going to have transaction processing because it's, again, a financial impacting system. So does the system does it calculate completely, accurately, and timely, right, for the data it's doing? Think of ADP again, payroll processor. You need to know, is it being processed completely, accurately, timely, right? So those are the objectives you'll have in a SOC 1. If there is no impact, go over to the no side. What commitments do they make to customers? Again, security, like I mentioned, almost all of them have it. I've never seen one without it. So let's just say security is included in everyone. So security would be there, right? Basically, protection of customer data is almost in every contract or every service level agreement, etc. Availability, confidentiality. Those are the two, in addition to security, that I see the most common. A lot of SLAs or service level agreements will have availability in there. Confidentiality is very similar to security in a lot of aspects because it's protection of data. The one thing confidentiality does add that I usually ask when I'm scoping is, do you make a commitment regarding customer data destruction if they leave the service? So if a client's customer leaves, do they commit to secure destruction of that data? That's where that triggers confidentiality for me. The other two categories, processing integrity and privacy, not as common. Again, we can do a whole nother training on that, but basically think of ADP as a processing. Again, that would tie into SOC 2 processing integrity. Privacy, I've got a whole article on privacy about data processors versus data controllers. Privacy is really only impacted if it's a data controller who's got data subjects in mind. Okay. Scoping the timing. I talked about type 1 and type 2 before. Really quick, I want to get through this. Type 1, you've got a single point in time report. Why is it a single point in time? Because the report is on the suitability of the design of the controls and implementation as of a certain date, right? So that's why it's a type 1. The type 2 has everything that the type 1 has, but it also talks about operational effectiveness of those controls over a period of time in the past. Think of it like a financial statement audit. You've got the balance sheet as of a point in time. You've got the income statement that tells the story from the past year. Similar here. Type 1, is it implemented as of this date? Type 2, how did it operate over the past year? So that's where you'll have testing, more testing, and especially you'll show the description of that testing in the report itself. Type 1, you don't show testing because really you're just determining, is it suitably designed and implemented as of this date? Type 2, you do show the testing of operational effectiveness. So again, that adds another layer of complexity to the audit, adding cost. That's why you want to consider, what are you doing for the client? Type 1, less money. Type 2, more money. Okay. Other pricing factors. What do we need to know? Nature and complexity of the environment. That's going to be the biggest one. Are we talking, I usually do it as low, medium, high. What are we dealing with? Is it highly complex? Is it not that complex? Is it a regulated industry? How many applications do we have? If you've got actual locations in scope, how many servers are at those locations? Control maturity. Are they doing this for the first time or have they been through it before with maybe other frameworks? What resources do they have? How many people do they have there? Especially ones that are going to help the audit. What trust services categories or in SOC 2 or SOC 1, number of objectives, right? If we're dealing with security, availability, confidentiality, again, I've seen those three tied together quite a bit. You add in the other two, processing integrity and/or privacy, that adds a lot of cost because it adds an additional layer of testing that's not covered under the other ones. Are there any other audits or frameworks that are involved? If they're doing, let's say, ISO 27001, again, maybe they have a more mature control environment. Maybe you need to think about SOC 2 Plus. That's where you'd have to consider that. Third parties, who's involved? What are the subservice organizations? We talked about GRC tools before. When I talk about subservice, by the way, if we're, let's say, a SaaS application and we're sitting on an infrastructure provider such as AWS or Microsoft Azure, that's a subservice organization because they're providing the underlying hosting of where our data is, right? So that's where they're a subservice org. Type 1 versus type 2, we just talked about. And then from a firm point of view, we need to figure out, again, skill set of the people, who's got prior experience, personnel costs, working with specialists, et cetera. That's all going to factor into this engagement or any SOC engagement that we're scoping and developing the practice. So typical SOC engagement, what does it look like? Really, we're looking at planning the engagement. How do we time it, test it, and report it? So in planning, we're going to say, okay, what, again, controls do we have, categories for either the objectives that are in scope for SOC 1 or the categories of SOC 2. So what's our control set? How many controls are we dealing with? Are we dealing with 100 controls, 300 controls? How many are we talking about here? What are our audit risks? So client has risk management, right, and risk assessment. We have to think about audit risk assessment. What are the risks to the audit? And how we might think, I always think about it as, would the reader of the report be misled? And if so, how? And how do we mitigate from an audit point of view that risk, right? Think about it that way. What client personnel are needed? So are you going to need the IT administrator? You're going to need the head of HR, et cetera. Who are you going to need? Get that scheduled for interview sessions. And then how is the evidence going to be gathered? Are you going to use a portal? Is it going to be email, screen sharing? I usually, during interview sessions, we'll do screen sharing if the client's okay with that, take some screenshots, et cetera. But you want to do that ahead of time because you don't want to go in thinking you're going to do that. And the client says, no, we can't do that. So you need to think about that during your planning. Again, planning, so huge to make the engagement go smoother. That goes for financial statement audits too, when I used to do those. So big factor there. Again, timing. If we're doing type 1, when are the controls going to be implemented? So if they're saying we'll have them implemented by the beginning of December, okay, let's aim for a December 31 type 1 maybe. If it's a type 2, how long of a period do you need? You need to test before the end of that period, because let's say if they want to do a 6-month SOC 2 type 2 ending in December, we want to make sure we get out there in December because there's certain controls you need to test during the period. There's certain controls that you're going to sample over the entire 6-month period that we've been doing. So you want to think about that. And as far as when you're going to time this engagement from a testing point of view, schedule, again, sessions with the correct personnel that we determined during planning. Testing itself, I usually use a NIST-based approach. So interview, examine, and test, asking questions during the testing sessions, making sure they do what they wrote in their policies and procedures, examine through observation of settings, configurations, screenshots, et cetera. Testing can be sampling, reperformance, et cetera. Then reporting. So a lot of firms will help with the system description, which is a non-attest service, which I mentioned briefly in the independent slide. As long as you're helping just develop information that's already been provided, and then they are ultimately management of the client has to supervise it and understand what's being done, that's an okay non-attest service. I recommend putting that in engagement letter. Can have a whole session on that separately. Ensuring the file is compliant with the standards during reporting, finally drafting the report, and then finalizing with a rep letter, subsequent events. Similar to financial statements, we need rep letters, we need subsequent events. Okay, so here's an implementation checklist that I've got for you. Great slide here. What SOC services to offer. Again, we're going to do SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC Cyber, all of the above. You got to figure that out. Who's going to be the lead from a CPA point of view? Who's going to be the staff that's going to support that CPA? Is it going to be other CPAs? Is it going to be non-CPAs? Is it going to be people with IT degrees? Is it going to be outsourced, etc.? Do you need education and training for these people? Identify current or potential clients and key client personnel that are involved. Evaluate your independence of these clients. Again, you have to be independent. A huge important factor. Establish your QC process. Determine the pricing methods. Develop marketing and website content. Join trade associations or similar organizations, like I mentioned, AICPA, ISACA, ISSA, all those organizations. Register for peer review. Once you have established a practice, you have to have a peer review within 18 months of issuing your first report. Again, peer review is done. Ultimately, it's the State Board of Accountancy that signs off on peer review, but you can use the AICPA's peer review program to help facilitate that. So you can do it that way, or you can do it directly with the state board. Regularly evaluate the need for additional services. So again, let's say if a client is currently doing SOC 2, but they want to do ISO 27001 in the future, think about that. Think about how you would establish that part of your practice as well, and who would need to be involved. Okay, and then we've have other SOC-related services. I talked about readiness assessments or gap assessments. Again, where is the client now versus where they need to be have a successful SOC 2 engagement. Again, you can make recommendations. You can't implement. You still have to be an auditor. You can say, yeah, here's a list of things that can help you with this, but I'm not going to make the decision for you. You have to make it. Or do your own research. Performed under the consulting standards. And implementation consulting is different. So if you wanted to do that, that's fine. You are then precluded from being the auditor. But you can design and implement controls for your clients to meet SOC goals that another auditor is going to have to come in and test. It's basically you're determining you're going to do a consulting practice for SOC, right? And there's also technical implementations. If you have a lot of technical expertise where people are, let's say, cloud architects, things like that, you can help a client establish a whole environment that's based on meeting cloud requirements as well as SOC requirements. So you can help consulting with that. And then you can also do compliance or engagement management on behalf of the client with the auditor, right? So a lot of clients, maybe they don't understand SOC 2 and what's required of the auditor, but you do. So you can help them with that. Again, you're not going to be able to be the auditor at that point, but you can help them facilitate. I promised I was going to give you resources, and here's the delivery of that promise. So the AICPA, you can just look up AICPA SOC Practice Toolkit. They have that. They have SOC services pages. They have non-authoritative resources and publications. Similar, I mentioned that FAQ on SOC 2 tools before. You can search all these things and find them. If you have any trouble, you can always reach out to me. I'll give you my email at the end here, but also you can see my LinkedIn is at the bottom. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn. I write a lot of articles on SOC very regularly, and I'm always happy to answer questions. I love answering questions and helping people out. So learning, training, certification programs, again, such as the SOC School, when you're on today, other learning that's out there as well. Non-AICPA organizations that are related to SOC, such as ISOC, I mentioned before, and then the other frameworks in case you need that, so such as NIST, HIPAA, PCI, ISO, CSA, etc. So that's other resources that you can have. Okay, so a quick summary. We looked at the overview. We looked at the value prop, what's needed, scoping and pricing, typical engagement process, implementation checklist, other practice areas and resources. So I have an FAQ here, but also if you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Are we too late? No, absolutely not. The SOC, again, going back to that slide I had early on, has only been growing exponentially over the last couple of years. There's constant need for more SOC engagements, more people doing audits, and more people doing quality audits, right? So, without getting into too much detail, there's been some good, some bad out there. That happens in any industry, right? So some clients are starting to say, oh, we need a different auditor. So definitely it's not too late. You can definitely get out there and do a lot of SOC work in the field. What's easier, SOC 1 and 2? I hear that sometimes, and it's a typical IT answer is it depends. And that works here because SOC 1 can be sometimes much easier. Sometimes it can be much harder, right? So if you have to do the financial processing of transactions, that can add complexity to it. But maybe that's easier because the SOC 2 is super complex, right? So very similar. I had a recent discussion with a client who had a pretty standard SOC 1 with IT general controls and some basic stuff. But then their SOC 2 was a SOC 2 plus, also with a Section 5 mapping to other frameworks. And their SOC 2 was hundreds of pages, whereas the SOC 1 was less than 100 pages. So it just depends on what the engagement is, what the client needs are, and what their customer demands are. What about SOC 3? SOC 3, again, you have to, what's important to know about SOC 3 that I did not mention before is that in order to do SOC 3, even though it's a redacted report, you still have to do all the work of the SOC 2. So you have to do all the testing, you have to do all the documentation, evidence gathering, etc. You're just doing a more basic report. So some people say, oh, I just want a SOC 3. And I'll say, okay, that really doesn't save you much cost, if anything at all, because we still have to do everything. Oh, but it's a smaller report. Yeah, but the back end of what's involved is still pretty heavy, right? So that's where SOC 3 would get a little bit more complex. Maybe you save some time in the review process because you don't have a Section 4 of testing to review, but ultimately you still have to do all that work in SOC 3. Again, we talked about SOC tools before. It's a popular hot topic out there right now. Definitely there's ways to use them as both client and auditor, and just make sure you do your due diligence on them, making sure you're using them properly, making sure that they're configured properly by the clients to pull the right data, right? So if you are going to rely on a tool to pull data, is it configured? Is it pointing to the right environment? What's the data you're getting? How do you know completeness and accuracy? That's an important one for peer review. Completeness and accuracy is required for any SOC engagement. So think about it from if the tool is pulling a population of changes and telling you, yeah, it followed the procedure. Okay, how do I know it captured them all? So that's the type of thing you want to think about when you're thinking about tools. And then can I work with other people or firms to formulate the team? Yes. So I mentioned before, you can do outsourcing 1099s, specialists. So you can use them to help facilitate the actual testing team, the engagement team, part of the review team, part of the QC process, etc. I've done that myself where I've helped firms with their QC process. I've helped them with practice or kind of dry runs for peer review, etc. You can definitely do that from working with other firms, especially if, let's say, you've got one or two clients that need a SOC and that's really it. Well, a lot of times what will happen is the engagement partner, the CPA, will get trained up enough to be able to sign the report. Then they'll outsource a lot of the testing to another firm who does this more. I've seen that happen many times with a lot of success. As long as, again, the engagement partner understands what's required from a documentation, policy and procedure, firm policy and procedure point of view, etc. So that's something you can do. This is my contact info. Oh, we do have a question. But yeah, here's my contact info for both my LinkedIn and email. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. Again, I love answering questions. So you can always ask me there. You can send me an email, whatever you need. Do you typically add the SOC 3 as an addendum to a SOC 2? So yeah, typically what happens is I'll say, okay, here's the price of the SOC 2. Here's the add-on for the SOC 3, right? As a separate line item in the statement of work that I'm gonna present to the client. Ultimately, you have to treat them as two separate engagements, but I kind of lump the price in. So let's say if I'm charging $30,000 for a SOC 2, and I'll charge $3,000 to do the SOC 3, because basically, what am I charging for? I'm charging for the time to develop that separate report and do a separate QC process of that report, right? And the file. Ultimately, though, you have to have two separate files. You have to have a SOC 2 file, a SOC 3 file. What happens, though, is you copy paste a lot of that SOC 2 file over and then create the SOC 3 file from there. Why? I always like to, from a risk point of view, I always like to think of a legal mindset. I think every engagement, every report should have its own standalone file. That's why I do it that way. So to answer your question, Caitlin, I do have it as an addendum from a statement of work pricing point of view, but ultimately on the back end, when we have our engagements in our file directory, you'll see two separate files for SOC 2 and SOC 3. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, feel free to add on in the chat for that. Richard said before, non-security SOC 2 when you're performing an audit over a cache and points. Yeah, sure. There can be other examples too. Again, haven't really seen it. I would say, going back to Raymond's point, I've seen it in every SOC 2 I've ever seen. But in theory, you could do it without it. I just haven't seen that actually happen. Any other questions before we kind of close this out and I pass it back over to Joel? Any other questions coming through? Happy to answer them as we're wrapping up here. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you learned something today. Again, any follow-on questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them, but I don't see anything else coming through. So with that, Joel, I'm going to turn it back over to you to kind of close this out for us. And again, I just want to say I appreciate everybody taking the time today. I really love teaching and happy to share my knowledge with everybody that attended. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you to all of our attendees that were here today. And if you're interested in earning CPE, I'm going to play a video that's going to show you how to do that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Blake.
Today's webinar has ended. We hope you enjoyed it. To earn CPE for watching, download the free Earmark app. Scan the QR code on the screen to visit the download page. Open the app and create your account. Use a valid email address where you will receive CPE certificates. Then register for the course. You can search for it by tapping on the magnifying glass icon on the home screen and then entering the name of this webinar. If you're attending the live stream of this webinar, keep an eye out for an email letting you know when the quiz is available in the next few days. Pass the quiz to earn your CPE credits. Then tap the button to email yourself a CPE certificate. Stay tuned for more webinars from Earmark. We appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.